I wanted to introduce a good friend of mine. This is Bill Bellows. He earned his BS, MS, and PhD in mechanical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. And they finally said, Bill, you got to go out and get a job after all that. So Bill is now an associate fellow in the end-to-end thinking network at Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne out in Canoga Park. They're the folks that build the rocket that sends the spacecrafts up, so heavy-duty stuff. Away from work, Bill is the president of the End-to-End Thinking Network, and they have a conference in June this next year, 19th to the 21st?
23rd.
23rd.
Right.
Out in Canoga, where it's going to be?
Where it's warmer, Los Angeles.
Warmer.
Yes.
It's warmer every place. Anyway, he's also a board member of the Deming Institute and Volunteers of America Los Angeles chapter and the American Youth Soccer Association in Valencia, California. He also serves as the editorial board of the Lean Manufacturing Journal, and he lives in Valencia with his wife Monica and two children, Allison and Winston. Bill didn't mention it, but he also offers something close to an MBA course as part of the End-to-End Thinking Network based on the work of Deming, Taguchi, Akoff, and DeBono, and others. And most of those courses are free. And is Tim Higgins in here? Tim, you're starting one of the classes soon, aren't you? It's a
24th.
On the 24th? It's looking at the new economics over about a 4-week period. And it's a call-in thing. You're still sending the books out if somebody wants a book?
No, they can't afford that anymore. You have to get your own book or get
Gotta get your own book. Anyway, that's an outstanding way to kind of get an introduction into what Dr. Deming is talking about. And I think coupled with quality as a business strategy, which we're going to hear more about in the next session, that course is just a powerful body of knowledge. Maybe you can talk to Bill about those courses in the Q&A session. So with that, Dr. Bellows.
I was thinking long before I heard about Dr. Deming and getting my 3 degrees from RPI, I was maintaining a single source supplier, which I knew at the time was going to save me a lot of trouble. So this presentation is intended to build upon Deming's ideas, and Taguchi's ideas, and others, and not only look at social impacts of organizations, but technical impacts. And that's where it comes into this notion of do you see what I see? And it also builds well upon my marathon partner, Mike Twitty, presented. Okay. And so there's the aim. The aim of the session is to present a proposal for better thinking about thinking, because I believe our awareness of our thinking, which is also, again, what Mike was built upon so well, is everything. Beginning with a series of simple questions, the answers to which are always, it depends. The answers reveal assumptions made in how we allocate resources, how we prioritize our time, personally as well as organizationally. And this session offers insights for how Taguchi's ideas on quality loss have been integrated into Deming's work with new economics to establish a new way to manage resources, which we refer to at Rocketdyne as Purposeful Resource Management. And what's behind the purposefulness is that we've given thought to it. It's not just all reflex action, which it would be the case if it was a reflexive resource management associated with the prevailing style of management. Okay, so I live in, as Dick said, in Valencia, California, which is about an hour or so south of New Cuyama, California. And this sign really exists. When the sign was put in, the population was 562 people. Elevation 2,150 feet above sea level. Established in 1951. And as Mike would say, you can laugh now. But I like to say is I think it's funnier, I don't know if it's funnier or sadder, than you can add those numbers up, but how many of you work in organizations where a decision will be made based on the 4663? Even if you point out the math error, because it doesn't matter. All right, so my experience the last 22 years is working for the company that makes rocket engines. One of our most recent engines, the R68 engine, to the right there is a booster engine for the Delta IV vehicle. Size-wise, it's about 18 feet tall. On the left is a jet engine turned into a tank engine. And it was there I first heard about Deming's ideas and Taguchi's ideas when I worked in Connecticut in the 80s. And just to give you a sense of what this, do you see what I see? What Myron Tribe has told us is that what we see depends on what we thought before we looked. And if we don't pay attention to how we think, then all we'll see is what we see and won't think anything more of it. Okay. So what do you think is the leading use of alligator skin in the United States today? See, as Mike would say, the answer is it depends. It depends on whether or not they're alive or dead. So the actual answer is, provided alligators are not extinct, the leading use is holding alligators together. Okay. Who makes the best automobile tires in the world today? See, if you were to answer the question with it depends, it would depend on what? Does it depend on what your definition of automobile is? Does it depend on your definition of tires? Is there any word in there that might be a clue as to why there might be more than one answer to this question? Best. Yeah. Okay, so what do you mean by best? What if I said best in snow? Is that enough information? Or there might be different types of snow. So there's snow in New England where I grew up, and there's snow, I'm sure, there must be snow out here. And we could say, snow like you get in Iowa, and is that enough information? Maybe not. Maybe it's snow in Sioux City. Then we can ask, is it freshly fallen snow or has snow been on the ground for a while? But if we're not willing to clarify, we just treat best as best and snow as snow, and then just move on. And with that same thinking, what do we call the person who graduates last in their class in medical school, Mr. Royalty?
A graduate.
Doctor. And we all know that all doctors are the same, so we can just interchange them, or maybe they're actually different, and that goes back to variation. But this question is what got me thinking about thinking in the early 90s when I was being called in time after time, and the answer to this question was what? How much time do you think is spent, where I've worked, and if any of you are working in industry, spent discussing parts that are good, things that are going well? Got a friend who's the vice president of quality for a semiconductor company that goes to Southeast Asia once or twice a year, and I asked him if he's going to discuss semiconductors that are going well. He said, no, not quite. But for a student, the question is how much time is spent studying for the final exam, questions from weekly quizzes in the midterm, which were correct. Chances are very little. And so it's the same reasoning, and the reasoning is what? Why don't we study the things we got right on the quizzes in studying for the final? Why do we study the questions we got wrong in studying for the final?
You want to fix what was broken.
And the assumption is behind the things we got well is what? That we understand it. Okay. All right, so I took this photo of a steam line being replaced in a plant in Southern California. Steam lines were being replaced when? When they stopped working. Yet for the 7 years we lived in Connecticut, about 5 or 6 miles north of Yale, where Dr. Deming got his PhD, the president of Yale in that time frame was replacing all the steam lines on the Yale campus before they broke, because he felt it was cheaper to replace them before they broke than afterwards, but it's not very glorious work. And the headlines in New Haven Register read, Yale gets its ducks in a row. See, you become a hero by fixing things after they break, but it might cost the organization more. Okay. Prior to meeting with a senior NASA executive, gosh, 10 years ago now, he wanted to know what we were going to be talking about when I went to visit him. And I said, well, I want to talk about this whole notion of interchangeable parts. And he was aware of that. And I said, just throw out a question. We were owned by Boeing at the time. And I said, when Boeing goes out on a contract, I said, what letter grade is required for all the parts we purchase? Worldwide, from acids, aluminum, software, Inconel, what letter grade is required? And what do you think he said? He said A+. You know what the letter grade requirement is? And I hope you continue to fly. Letter grade requirement is actually D-. Here's why. So it's not an A+. The letter grade requirement is not failing. Because as long as it's passing, it meets requirements. Failing means requirements are not met. So how many of you have taken a class pass-fail? Okay, when you go to work in industry, that's how the procurement system works. That's also how the quality system works. Right, but as a student, you know there's a difference between an A, a B, a C, and a D. Okay, in corporations, we treat them as all the same. There is no variation. We say an A, a B, a C, and a D. See, we treat them as all the same. The quality system doesn't distinguish. But you know when the difference shows up? So if we go out and buy a part, we buy this cap from one supplier, we buy this bottle from another supplier, and they all meet requirements. They're all passing parts. When does the difference between an A and a D show up for this cap? When you go to put it on the bottle. But at that point, can the person doing final assembly complain about the quality of the cap? No, because it's a good part. See, it's as ludicrous as watching the Super Bowl, let's say last year's Super Bowl, and watching the newscaster, the sportscaster, talk about the quality of the pass thrown by Tom Brady as the ball leaves his hand. Right? That's how we run corporations. We look at the quality of the ball. That was a great pass, just left Brady's hand. Where's Brady going now? He's walking off the field. And he walks over to his coach, and his coach says, aren't you waiting for the ball to be caught? He says, my part was fine. And if you notice, after the game, there was a shouting match between a Giants fan and Tom Brady's wife, the model. And she made some disparaging remark about Tom Brady, and she made a disparaging remark back, having to do with the wide receiver should have caught the ball. And Brady's remark afterwards was to accept that he was responsible for the ball not being caught. Because he sees himself and the wide receiver as connected as part of a system. His wife saw it as two separate pieces, which is how most organizations operate. And so here, we would treat a 60 as a passing part. We would treat a 70, 80, 90, and 100 as all passing parts. They all meet requirements. And what this means is all the stuff you learned about Mike, what Mike presented earlier about variation is disregarded as long as requirements are met. All we're paying attention to is it good or is it bad? Is it passing or is it failing? And I want to build upon that. Okay, how'd you do on the test? How many of you have ever been asked that question? Fairly routine. Okay. So I was having a conference call a couple years ago with a sister of a coworker. She had to write an article for a business class to interview someone in corporation. And so I asked her to draw this diagram, so I asked her if she'd ever heard this question before. And I said, so you're the input, the output is the grade. I said, what other inputs are there? And she said her commitment. I said, okay, what else? She said her energy. I said, what else? And she couldn't think of anything else. Kind of paused. So I said, have you ever been in a classroom where another student asked a question and you learned from the answer? And she said, yes. So then I said, well, then other students are an input. She said, I guess so. I said, given other students as an input, what other inputs can you see? And she said, my professor. I said, okay. Oops, take it back. And she began to see, she listed her professor, her parents, and her brother. So I said, how many inputs are there? She said, well, there's an infinite number. I said, how come you couldn't see them before? She said, I was only focusing on me. Well, then I asked her if the appropriate question is not how did you do on the test, but how did we do on the test? So I go, once a quarter, I visit Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, the largest engineering school west of the Mississippi, so they claim, in terms of engineering graduates. And in there, trying to explain some of these ideas and how we're trying to get organizations to think as a system, it never fails to ask, well, I mean, what makes this so difficult? And I say, well, when are you willing to drop the my GPA and start calling it our GPA? When are you going to admit that you're part of a team and you didn't score the goal all by yourself? And I don't know if there's anything harder to do than have a student stop referring to the grade as theirs alone, and realize that you actually had help. And this is what Dr. Deming's talking about. And I know when I think back what it was like going to school, and all the time I spent studying heat transfer, solving every conduction equation in the book. If anyone told me that, that I didn't do all that work myself, I'd say, no way, I did it all myself. Then I realized I actually had help. Upon reflection, I realized I had help. At the time, I would have found that hard to believe. So imagine instead of moving away from how did you do on the test, how did I do on the test, we start talking about how did we do on the test, how did we do on the design, how did we do on the proposal, how did we do on the contract. And in so doing, we have an organization where teamwork is more than an expression. Okay. So this is work I started putting together some time ago and we revisited recently. And this is an explanation for how I think organizations operate. We have a belief that if you follow the steps to make a part or deliver a student, as long as you follow those steps, what comes out is good all the time. And not only are the parts good, they're equally good. So all the parts made are absolutely interchangeable in this model. And then when the other parts are made, they're also made following their steps. And if you ever get a bad part, what happens? You missed a step, and that step is called the root cause. And as long as we then do an investigation as to what that root cause, and there's only one root cause, of course. As long as we can eliminate that root cause, then we'll only have good parts, and that's the model. So then I have to come up with explanations as to what's the limit behind this root cause thinking, because we have this belief that everything in life can be explained by one cause. And I've come up with one that I haven't been challenged on, which is, if there is a root cause for everything, then why do we need two parents? Right? No one's ever said, well, there's actually a case where, I said, stop it. So what we do is we have a belief that we make the good parts, and then what do we do with them? Because a Boeing airplane or a rocket engine is not a bunch of parts that fly in close formation, but that is how the organizations are managed. So we take the parts, we take a bunch of them, put them together to create a wing or a turbopump, and because the parts are good, they fit. And then we take the other parts and put them together into another subassembly, and because they're good, they fit. And then we take the subassemblies and put them together in a final assembly, and of course, because they're good, they fit, and when we turn it on, it works. That's the model. And I find this model operates so well that when I ask people what's wrong with the model, they can't think of what's wrong with the model because it's how they live their lives. This is what the organizations are about. If you just follow these steps, you'll pass the exam. If you follow these steps, you'll make a good part every single time. This is the model of interchangeable parts. And what's missing is there's no variation in this model. So everything you learned from Mike earlier about looking at variation, or yesterday if you watched David Langford's session looking at variation, well, we don't have to look at any of that, because as long as the parts are good, we can ignore all that variation, because it doesn't matter, is the model. And if it doesn't matter, then it doesn't matter who we hire to work on our doctor's office, because they're all doctors, they're all the same. That's the model. But the same model can be said for all engineers. They're all the same. Let's just go get the cheapest one. In fact, our daughter a few years ago took her to a soccer tournament, and I was trying to explain to her this notion of buying commodities. And I said, commodity, two things are viewed a commodity if we think they're the same, in which case we buy based on what? And she said, price. So, okay. So we went into the store to buy snacks for this long road trip to Tahoe. And I said, okay, so are rice cakes a commodity? And she said, yes. So I said, which ones do we buy? And she picked these. I said, what about bottled water? She said, yes. Well, Allison's a goalkeeper. So I said, what about goalkeepers? Are they a commodity? She said, no, we're not commodities. Okay, where do you go to work? All right, now let's start looking at variation. And my approach is to take things we do at home, try to bring them into a work setting, and look at the contrast. And so here's one I learned from watching our son years ago. And he was cutting a piece of wood. He was actually asking me to cut the piece of wood. He was 4 years old at the time. And so, but if you were, as an adult, at home in the garage working on a woodworking project, and you had to cut a piece, not into two equal pieces, but you just had to cut the piece of wood to be a given length, how many lines would you draw across the top face? And how many of you would draw one line? That's a fairly standard answer. How many of you would draw two lines wider than the width of the blade and then say, anywhere in between, it doesn't make a difference? That's how rocket engines are made. That's how airplanes are made. That's how pretty much every product out there is made. And the model is it doesn't really matter where you are within. So we use what's called tolerances, and tolerances go back to the late 1800s, actually late 1700s, supposedly first used in France, as a means to achieve this notion of interchangeable parts. And the role of tolerances is to accept variation, because if we didn't have, part of the reason we can't do this is because we would never have commerce, we'd never have agreement as to what the length is, what the thickness of a table is, because of variation. So we accept variation exists, and then start pretending that everything within is identical. And that's the macro system model. Okay? And so some examples of this. If we're looking at hole diameter, machining a hole in a plate, what we have found is that machinists will make the hole as small as possible. Why is that? Because they could always make it larger. And chances are they start on the low side and creep up to that line, and then once they've achieved the minimum, what do? Stop. And what is the motive to stop?
Why spend more time?
Why spend more time? The boss says, I'm paying you to machine 50 holes an hour, and we're just out there to get it done. Okay? Next example, term paper page count. Double spaced? What size font? Okay. Then the outer diameter on a shaft, and I didn't include an image here, but I'll give you a visual image or a mental image. My father-in-law in 1950 was a machinist, General Electric in Schenectady. He operated the world's largest lathe. He said the tool fixture was taller than him. The parts he machined were the shafts that went on the St. Lawrence Seaway. They were 120 feet long, over 15 feet in diameter. They came in oversized, and his job was to get them from an oversized condition to just within spec, and he got paid for every one that was completed. Then he would argue with a quality inspector as to whether or not it met requirements. Okay. Last summer I was in England, and friends I was visiting have two sons, and one, Carl, had an ice popsicle, they call it a lolly. And she says, Carl, you have to eat it outside. So correlated outside. Okay. So what you see going on in each of these circumstances is in each case, the person given the task is meeting requirements, but simultaneously, what else is each person doing? Doing what? Minimizing effort for who? For them. And what do we call that in corporations? No, we call that teamwork. Who's on the team? They are. So you'd be a fool not to be on your own team. So they're each focusing on them, and what allows that behavior? That's right. So you go to a corporation, you're given a set of requirements with latitude because nothing's defined exactly, and you get to choose if you deliver to the next person an A, a B, a C, or a D. Each of you get to choose. That's variation. The psychology is, how do you feel today? Right? If you want to deliver a D to the next person, can they turn around and complain? Can they? What is the ground for complaining? It didn't meet requirements? But you know, the person before you might be doing the same to you. How's that feel? Right? And what Deming showed the Japanese in 1950 is what comes around goes around. So it doesn't matter where you are. If you're doing it to the next person, eventually you're doing it to yourself. But if your view of the system is that there's a beginning and an end, then it's like seeing out-of-state plates working at a gas station and say, hey, here's a way to make money. But if they're local, we say, no, we won't cheat them if they're local. We only cheat them if they're over, if they're coming in from out of state. What Deming's talking about is what comes around goes around. It doesn't matter where they are, they're part of the system. So the macro system model that I just showed you, relative to cutting a piece of wood, would say it doesn't matter if we're on the high side or the low side, no one will really notice the difference. Well, then I ask, well, why at home do we notice the difference? So I asked a colleague once who admitted to using one line at home and 2 lines at work, why he focused on 1 line at home and 2 lines at work. And his explanation was, because at work I cut metal and at home I cut wood. Which I thought was profound. Then I asked him who designed the product at home, and he admitted that he would. I asked him who bought the products, the materials at home, and he did. Who cut them all out? He did. Who designed it? He did. Who lived with it? He did. That's one company. Who designs it at work? Someone else. Who does final assembly? All right, so what you see at work is as if we're a bunch of parts flying in close formation. And so, buying a rocket engine would be like going to IKEA, and the person says, here's your rocket engine. It looks like a bunch of parts. Oh, well. But they're all interchangeable, of course. Okay, that's the thinking. And the beauty is, if you graduate from here thinking you caused the grade, you are really well prepared to work in that organization. Okay. On the other hand, what Dr. Taguchi's talking about, and this also gets into the loss function, as Mike mentioned, as an element of profound knowledge. The reason we focus on that 1 line at home, because we understand that at home that how close we are to that line affects how well this fits. Because we're thinking about this piece of wood as being part of a system, not just a piece of wood. So the microsystem model, by contrast, admits that no matter how you follow the steps, there will always be variation. There's degrees of good. It's not absolutely good or absolutely bad. There's actually degrees of good. There's variation. And because there's degrees of good, there's degrees of fit in assembly and final assembly, and then there's degrees of performance. And without degrees of performance, there'd be no room for improvement. So without variation, we're stuck in this model that says variation does not exist, good is good. And so what does continuous improvement mean in a world of no variation? We'll get to that next. But first, okay. which is a lead into, there's two types of thinking. There's category thinking, which we're using all day long and not paying attention to it, but what if we became aware of it? We'd realize that in category thinking, we create absolutes. The absolutes are viewing things as digital, discrete or digital, and we say things like, there are those that understand binary and there are those that don't. There are parts that are good and parts that are bad. And we put things in one of those two categories, if it's only two categories, and the assumption behind everything in a given category is what? Is that they're all the same. So this is like thinking that all Mormons are the same, all Catholics are the same, all French are the same. That thinking is what's behind category thinking. It's one size fits all. The other mode of thinking is to view things as on a continuum, and in doing so realize that everything is relative. Okay, as a result, we see things with wholeness, and this is like analog time as opposed to digital time. We see shades of gray. We have better, faster. Something's screwed up here, okay. What I'm showing on the left-hand side is we can break categories into categories, which is like saying there's not only are there cats and dogs, but there's types of cats and types of dogs. It's like saying there's different types of music. Not sure what happened there. Okay. Phil Crosby on quality, he said zero defects is another way of saying do it right the first time. Quality is defined as conformance to requirements. That is category thinking, breaking things into parts. It's alive and well. Dr. Deming defined quality this way. He said a product or service possesses quality if it helps someone and enjoys a sustainable market. Okay, which mode of thinking is that? Is that category thinking or continuum thinking? Is he focused on the part or how it connects to others? Okay. Likewise, Dr. Taguchi, quality is the minimum of loss imparted to society by a product after its shipment. Taguchi would say, if you're an HMO and you replace all of your expensive doctors with cheap doctors as a means to reduce cost, what you've really done is just shifted the cost to the consumer. And that shifting of the burden, Taguchi calls loss. And so when someone does not pick up the nail in the parking lot, what they're doing is reducing their cost, but increasing the loss to others in society. Okay. When the hole is made as small as possible, the machinist is lowering his cost, but increasing the cost for others downstream, which is loss. And I've seen examples where machinists are encouraged to go faster, and one solution was a machinist realized in order to go faster, he would stop deburring the hole. So he would machine the hole, not remove the sharp edge, and he got an award for going faster. But the amount of extra effort he caused others was far less than what he saved. But all the holes met requirements. And that would be a savings if the holes weren't used. So if you buy a photocopier, which is cheaper, doesn't have feeders and sorters and breaks down more often, that is a savings to the corporation, provided it's never used. Okay. So Taguchi's view of the world is that there's a minimum point on this curve, and what he's looking at is, within requirements, there's a sweet spot. So what we do when we focus on that target dimension at home is we're cutting a piece of wood to be just the right length, that it fits in just right. If it's a little bit longer, it takes a little bit longer to fit in. If it's a little bit shorter, we have to fill that gap. But if, the reason we're focusing on the one line is that we suffer the loss at home. But at work, someone else suffers the loss, and we just watch it. And not only do we watch it, we don't think we contributed to it, because our part met requirements when the ball left my hand. And I've had people say, well, in our organization, Bill, we have compassion for one another. We have compassion for the people in assembly, which means we feel bad for them, but we didn't cause it. And out of the crisis, Dr. Deming's book in 1986, he said the Taguchi loss function is a better view of the world. It's a view of the world that accepts that there is variation, and where you are within requirements does affect others. The question then becomes, if you began to see that what you're doing to the others, when you begin to see that the trouble in assembly you're contributing to, the psychology piece of profound knowledge, Dr. Deming's belief, is that we would do something about that. Okay. Tom Johnson, who I saw speak at a Deming conference in Washington, 1987, made this quote there. He said, "How the world we perceive works depends on how we think. The world we perceive is a world we bring forth through our thinking." And what I see most days at work is a macro system model. We're focusing on bad parts, not good parts, watching assembly, looking for the root cause of everything that doesn't meet requirements with little suspicion that there's anything else to do. In spite of that, Tim and I and others are trying to make a difference. We're making with some growing momentum. And part of the momentum is coming up with models to explain the behavior. And it's hard for engineers that I work with to deny that at home they cut wood on that line. And when we've had people take that thinking to work, we've increased the performance of our products, which is how they operate in the field is significantly better, and how they assemble is significantly better, and that boils down to savings, and it's hard to ignore savings. The model we have is that we could increase individual awareness, which is personal transformation, of our thinking, right? As we become aware, as the people making the parts, or Tom Brady throwing the ball, as we become aware that the ability of the wide receiver to catch the ball we're responsible for, then it changes how we work together, it changes how we learn together, changes how we run the organization, and that should have a reinforcing effect on the organization. This is the model we're working with. From the New Economics, name of this chapter, the prevailing style of management must undergo transformation. The system cannot understand itself. The transformation requires an outside view, which Dr. Deming is providing with this book. The aim of this chapter, you say the aim of this exposure we're trying to give, is provide an outside view, a lens, as Mike showed you, and Dr. Deming called that lens a system of profound knowledge. He had to call it something. Okay. The system of profound knowledge provides a lens, provides a map of theory by which to understand the organizations that we work with. The first step is transformation of the individual. The transformation is discontinuous. It comes from an understanding of the system of profound knowledge. The individual transformed will perceive new meaning to life, to events, to numbers, to interactions between people. Now, if you were to feel around in your wrist for your pulse, try that. It's an exercise. See, the variation piece would be, if we were to actually go around and measure pulse, do you think we'd all have the same pulse? Okay, and how many of you would be below average? How many of you think pulse is caused by the wrist? Well, I mean, let's be honest. You think grade is caused by the student, so pulse must be caused by your wrist. But imagine working in an organization where the right wrist and the left wrist are given different goals for pulse. See, that's only an issue if they're part of the same body. Okay? And it's so amazing. You walk into an organization, you watch somebody presenting data, and the person presenting data thinks they caused the data. And the people watching thinking they're observing the person presenting the data. And the challenge we have for you is to realize that you're part of the system and you're contributing to the data. You're not an observer of the data, you're a participant in the system. Once the individual understands the system of profound knowledge, he'll apply its principles in every kind of relationship with others. He'll have a basis for judging his own decisions and for transformation of the organization that he belongs to. And the outside view, and Mike addressed this earlier. Okay. Resource management, another simple model in terms of how I see organizations, in terms of activities, and given a choice between being proactive and reactive, what we see is a heavy emphasis on being reactive because we won't work on things that are good because they're good. And then it took me a little while to see, well, there's another axis, and I'm sure there's another axis as well. Are the resources owned locally, or are people acting as if they're part of a system and it's really not my people, but actually our people? That the students are not my students, they're actually our students. And when you become a parent, you can learn to refer to your son or daughter as our son versus look at what your daughter did. Okay. So what we see is a strong preference for operating in the lower left-hand quadrant, and it fits in very well with the prevailing system of management. Okay. Now, is it better to be proactive or reactive? Yeah. Mike, is it better to be proactive or reactive? It depends. It depends. It depends. It depends. See, it depends on the context. See, when I'm talking about, imagine having a choice. See, you currently don't think you have a choice, but you have a choice to go to the doctor when you're sick, or you can go when you're well. You have a choice to study things you understand, to understand them better, or study the things you don't understand. What we're talking about is, imagine being in an organization where we are reactive by choice and proactive by choice. Reactive by choice means when the light bulb burns out, we're going to wait and then replace it. But now we know we're being reactive. But when it comes to putting gasoline in the car, it might be worthwhile to be proactive. There's a choice. So it's not that reactive is always bad and proactive is always good. What's important is that we realize that there is a choice. And we refer to the lower left-hand quadrant as reflexive resource management. That comes from Deming's admonition that pulling your hand off of a hot stove does not require any thinking at all. It's all reflex action. And on the right-hand side, it took a while to come up with the other type of resource management. And in doing Google searches, every time I come up with something, it was already used, already used, already used. And then I tried synonyms and came up with Purposeful Resource Management. And one found out that it's not trademarked, and its first use goes back to the 1890s, used by the US Department of Forestry for how to manage land. And I thought that was a nice tie. What we're talking about is, imagine people becoming aware of their thinking, becoming aware of the size of the system they're looking at, and realizing that being proactive is a choice, being reactive is a choice, focusing on tolerances is a choice, do it where it makes sense. Focusing on a target, managing variation from a target, is also a choice, and we would only do it if the net savings is worth it. So we're not talking about focusing on targets all the time, because that costs more, which is why sometimes it's better to be reactive. Being proactive would be putting an indicator of life on each of those light bulbs. Say, why don't we just replace it when it burns out? But when it comes to gasoline in the car, it might be worthwhile to have a gas gauge. Okay? It's a choice. How are we doing on time? 25 minutes?
Let's till the next session.
Okay, we got 25 minutes for questions. Yes?
In your talk, the one thing that you mentioned is that we don't address the things that are going well. I don't know how to formulate the questions to address the things that are going well. So how do we look for those questions? How do we formulate the questions to say, okay, it's going well. How do we fix it? Or what is there to address?
So the question is, how do we formulate questions about what is going well? Great question. What it comes down to is,
Maybe I can give you a concrete example.
go ahead.
How do you address a situation where you have a good instructor and teaches well, works well with students? What do you do for that instructor, or what do you do for the symbiosis there?
Well, how can we get with that instructor? So you're talking about a situation where there's a great instructor by whatever method you're choosing to define that. The question is, are they willing to share what they're doing with other instructors?
Sure, that may be one question.
Bill, isn't part of it the definition of well? I mean, when you
Yes.
well just meant
Yeah. Well, so I mean, how do you define well? I mean, the students who get the best grades.
I'd offer the questions, one of the questions you ask is, how could you do better? What could you do better? And by better, meaning what could you do that would make the overall system and aim of the system better? better achieve the aim. So locally, what can you do to improve that would be an improvement to the overall system?
So what I would offer is, could you imagine a university in which students realize that they alone did not cause their grades? And what would that campus look like? And what would the hallway conversations be like? What questions would the students be asking themselves in the dormitories? You know, what would the interactions be like at lunch? As opposed to, how do I get an A, and what do I have to do to pass this class? So if you have an environment where intuitively we all know that we are connected, and how well she catches the ball depends on how well you block and how, it creates a different set of, see, if you have the presence of mind to realize that these are two different environments, then you have to ask, which environment is your question coming from? And so our challenge has been, if we can create in people's mind a vision of, if you were to go into an organization where they, it goes back to the title, do you see what I see? Imagine an environment where everyone intuitively knew in a growing way what Deming's talking about in terms of elements of profound knowledge and how they interact, and that what you are doing, how well you are doing is how well we are doing. The more we could see that contrast, the more we would know how better we could allocate resources. That's what I would propose, is if you could begin to envision the environment being different. What Taguchi's talking about with loss, for example, is, he says loss is we want to minimize loss to society by a product after its shipment. Well, what constitutes loss? Well, if everything you see is normal, and meaning the prevailing style of management, then what does loss mean? Yeah. There is no loss, because everywhere you go, you see the same thing. So for you to go campus to campus around the United States, and they're all doing the same thing and all the same conversations, right? Professors being pitted against professors, not willing to collaborate on research, stealing graduate students, not being willing to share graduate students or equipment. That's prevailing system of management. But if you could see something, if you could imagine a different environment, and that's what Deming's offering, is the ability to imagine an entirely different place where there's entirely different questions. The questions are not about the root cause. The questions are, is that common cause variation or special cause variation? Then you begin to see that the loss is the difference between what we're doing and what we could be doing. And so there's a classic example of final assembly in the auto industry at a Ford plant. And if you can imagine the holes being on the low side, the outer diameters being on the high side, and how that goes, what do you think assembly would be like in that organization? So there's an account of a very senior Ford executive, and every time they did final assembly, rubber mallets were required to bang together the mating parts because they didn't quite fit. Taguchi would call that loss. The Ford plant would call that what? This is how you do assembly. You bang things together. Because again, in the macro system model, you can't challenge the parts because the parts are good. And so in a football field, it means every pass that Tom Brady throws that's within requirements should be caught. And if the wide receiver has to leap up and get smacked by the linebacker is out a week, we call that normal. Taguchi would call that loss. Right, throwing the ball behind the receiver as opposed to so what Taguchi's talking about is loss, but it's hard to see loss in a macro system model. So at this Ford plant, they banged together the mating parts whenever they did final assembly. Every once in a while, two went together without a mallet, and Ford had a term for that. The term was snap fit. But do you think within the Ford plant there were conversations amongst the new hires? Do you think the entire car could be snap fit? Right? And if those conversations were raised, what would the senior folks say? That's not how we do things here. You got two young guys I first met when I joined Rocketdyne in 1990. Are like this. They would have had that. It could be done that. It could be done without mallets. And these two guys were told in the early 90s. They were so excited about Deming's ideas and continuous improvement. And one of the senior guys turned to them and said, you guys are so cute. You're like two puppies chewing on an old shoe. Well, at this Ford plant, they went off and bought a product made by a company, a different company. Competitors, they would take them apart just like theirs. They bought products made by GM and Chrysler, assembled just like theirs. Their conclusion is, this is how you put cars together. Then they bought one made by Toyota and assembled it without mallets. And the assembly team couldn't believe the results. General manager could not believe the results. So the general manager asked them to take the car apart again. And they assembled it twice and never used a mallet. Never. They were so excited by the results, they called out senior folks from Dearborn who came out, according to the senior Ford manager there. And he said the senior guys came out, and the most senior person turned to the team after hearing the account, talking to the people who do final assembly, no mallets required, took it apart twice. The most senior person's response was, the customer will never notice the difference. And he said, one of them said, yeah, that's right. And the guy who told the accountant said they all trotted off, quote, happy as clams. See, that's the prevailing style of management. So what Taguchi's talking about is the hammering together is loss. And so what you have to say is, within this university, what is the corresponding loss? What are those conversations that are currently going on that are essentially lost, and what could they be instead? And you're moving the conversations from, my past was good, you should have caught it, to how could I help you learn? And what Deming's talking about is profound knowledge as a means by which you can understand how to shift from one environment to the other. And then questions change. But as long as things are the macro system prevailing style of management, then no one challenges loss. That loss does not exist. All those costs of students leaving the university, being turned off by their professors, that's just business as usual. You can't please everybody. Okay, other questions? Yes?
I'm curious, in your in-thinking network, is there any work that you do on mindfulness with people to sort of engage a stillness, to start thinking about these different paradigms and different ways of making choices? Or is it all kind of organizational?
Oh, no, there are say 5 levels of activity. One is brief exposure. It could be a brown bag session. It could be a one-on-one thing that I do or that Tim does or others do. We have a formal curriculum of seminars, which Dick mentioned earlier, which are offered year-round, most of which for free, a few of which by conference call. And those are, one-on-many like this is efficient, but it's not effective. And so what Tim and I do is once we get people exposed, then we find out, is David Langford style, it's you train men, you find out who's interested, where do you put your energy, and it's working with them one-on-one to advance their appreciation, and then it's helping them put these ideas into practice. And it's extremely active. And without that, but it's some type of exposure, a formal curriculum. It's one-on-one mentoring, coaching. It's helping them put it into practice. It's taking the folks we're working with and connecting with folks at other companies that we're working with and let them cross-pollinate. And the 5th element is looking to see how much more we can do with the internet to have distance learning and not just face-to-face. But those are, our curriculum, we called in 1995 a thinking roadmap. We now call it an in-thinking roadmap, is awareness of thinking. I'm not aware of anything else like it. A formal curriculum in which Tim presents 3 times a year the New Economic Studies session. Once a month we host a conference call, ongoing discussion. That's been going on for 13 years. That's all audio. beginning this February, started a webinar once a month. And the difference between the webinar and the conference calls is the webinar is the same 10, 11 people. So Mike is, which month do we have for you? September? So every September, Mike will deliver a webinar on what we call better thinking about the system of profound knowledge. Gypsy Rennie every September does a 90-minute webinar, better thinking about causes. And those are open to the public, and if you want to be on the mailing list, it's a contact. So that's what we're doing. Extremely active. And, and we want to make it as cheap as possible. And that's, and that doesn't include the Into and Thinking Network, which we formed in 2001 as a means to further, clarify what we're talking about and bring in a community of people to share those ideas. Yes, your hand's been up.
Yeah, in your thinking, or going from a macro, micro, is it integrated to where when you shift, if you use red and blue, do you realize the third option or the color of purple, or what happens as a tension between those two types?
Oh,
micro model, and I mean integration, rather, one or the other.
You mean as your question is, you're talking about the dynamics and going from an unknowing macro model to a knowing micro model?
To me, there'd be both unknown when you first start, but it's
Correct.
a different sort of integration of, if you're looking outwardly, going to inwardly, in that the perturbations at a micro scale could enter into the macro and cause enormous problems.
Yeah.
Vibration,
Yes, socially you would see,
or vice versa.
for people to move from one to the other, I'd say people are currently unknowingly practicing continuum thinking, category thinking, macro systems, micro systems. Yeah, the awareness could be shocking. I mean, the awareness could cause people to go into their holes and want to continue to fight for the current system because it's serving them well.
The binary thinking sort of put it in either one or the other, but right the dividing line, the boundary at that pivotal point.
Well, I think it's if you view it in terms of categories, if you view it as a continuum.
Yeah, if you start off that way.
But I would say, if you look at Deming's work, there isn't anything in there, if you ask people on a personal basis, that they would disagree with. And so as they become aware that variation exists, that we have inclinations, I'd say on a personal basis, no one would fight this. Organizationally, they would fight it for protecting themselves and their organization and their way of life. But on a personal basis, for anyone to say that a root cause does not exist, I mean, I think you can work with people one-on-one and get clarification and acceptance of variation, and so much of what Deming's talking about. The challenge is that's a very long model to work one-on-one with people. And I think if we had that ability to, our strategy has been to develop a network of people within the organization that can help deal with the perturbations you're talking about. So if there is a fight to maintain the status quo, there are more people in the organization besides Tim and I that can clarify what we're talking about, that have the ability to articulate that, who's against teamwork? Who's against united we stand? Who's against being part of a team? So I think the perturbations are the result of ignorance. And if you had clarity, I don't think there'd be a fight. The people who are fighting are the people that want to win the awards and think they caused the great all by themselves. The heroes would fight this.
For sure.
Yeah. And the people that want to claim their meeting requirements, and you show them, you're meeting requirements, but but you're eating the popsicle inside the doorway.
The spruce budworms that would be killed off for its forestry management if you had acid rain from Inco, from Canada, that would kill off the timber in the Northeast. What if it's the butterfly that's thinking, but we don't understand, or the loss of timber for industry?
Well, yes, and what you're talking about is seeing things as being connected. And I think the only saving, I think the reason for hope is that when people begin to see the connection, that they will act upon it, as opposed to, and I think the majority will act upon it, given a chance. Can we done?
Yeah, I was saying, we didn't allow for any time between sessions here, hoping for some self-organizing portion for this. So if you want to take a break, we're going to be meeting back here at 11. And speaking of butterflies, we got to get, and flying, we got to get Bill on an airplane. So we'll give his next talk on Monday.
Monday.
So let's take a break now and meet back here at 11.
Thank you. Bye.